You're going to jail, sweetheart, and I'll make sure you never step foot on a commercial aircraft again.
The words sliced through the cabin air like broken glass, sharp and unforgiving. Victoria Hartwell's voice carried the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from absolute power. Her manicured fingers adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist as she watched the handcuffs click into place around the young woman's delicate hands. The passengers in first class leaned forward in their leather seats, phones already recording, eager to witness what they assumed was justice being served. A thief caught red-handed. Drama at 35,000 feet. Content for their social media feeds. But none of them noticed the black Bentley tearing across the tarmac outside Terminal B at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, its tires gripping the wet asphalt with urgent precision. None of them saw the way ground crew members stepped aside, their radios crackling with nervous chatter. None of them knew that the man stepping out of that luxury sedan didn't just own stock in Meridian Airlines. He owned the company. And the young woman in handcuffs wasn't just any passenger, she was his daughter. When Marcus Blackwell stepped onto Meridian Flight 447, the silence would be deafening. The reckoning would be swift, and Victoria Hartwell would discover that some mistakes cost more than just your job, they cost everything you've built your identity around. Before we dive into this shocking story of justice at 35,000 feet, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. We love seeing our global community come together around stories that matter. And if you believe that respect shouldn't depend on the price of your clothes or the color of your skin, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now, let's go back to where it all began 47 minutes earlier when a young art student walked onto a plane with no idea that her life was about to change forever. The rain hammered against the reinforced windows of Gate A7, each drop exploding like tiny fireworks against the glass. Inside the terminal, the usual chaos of modern air travel hummed with mechanical precision, rolling luggage wheels on polished floors overhead, announcements echoing through the cavernous space, the constant beep of scanners and electronic boarding passes. Victoria Hartwell stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, her reflection sharp in the rain-streaked window. At 35, she had perfected the art of intimidation through presentation. Her navy blue Meridian Airlines uniform was tailored to perfection, not a thread out of place. Her blonde hair was pulled into an immaculate chignon, secured with a pearl-studded clip that caught the harsh terminal lighting. Diamond stud earrings, real ones, not the cubic zirconia most flight attendants could afford, glinted at her ears. Her makeup was flawless, her posture military straight. She checked her Cartier watch, a gift to herself after her promotion to senior purser 3 years ago. Boarding for Flight 447 to Los Angeles would begin in 12 minutes. 12 minutes to prepare herself for another performance of power, another opportunity to remind everyone exactly who controlled the cabin once those doors closed. Elena Victoria's voice cut through the ambient noise like a scalpel. The younger flight attendant, a 28-year-old Hispanic woman with kind eyes and nervous energy, hurried over from the boarding counter. "Yes, Miss Hartwell, I want you to watch the passengers carefully today. We've had too many irregularities lately. People thinking they can dress however they want and waltz into first class like they own the place." Victoria's lips curved into what might have been a smile on someone else's face. On her, it looked predatory. Standards exist for a reason, Elena. Our first-class passengers pay premium prices for a premium experience. Part of that experience is knowing they won't be surrounded by undesirable elements. Elena's dark eyes flickered with something that might have been disagreement, but she nodded dutifully. "Of course, Miss Hartwell. Good girl." Victoria's attention shifted to her reflection again, adjusting her name tag so it caught the light just right. Senior Purser Vi Hartwell. 15 years of clawing her way up from economy service to this position of authority. 15 years of taking orders from passengers who looked down on her, who treated her like hired help. Now, finally, she was the one with power. She was the one who decided who belonged and who didn't. The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the runways in stark, dramatic flashes. It felt appropriate somehow, like nature itself was setting the stage for what was about to unfold. Victoria smoothed her skirt one final time and walked toward the boarding counter, her heels clicking with military precision against the floor. She had no idea that in less than an hour her perfectly constructed world would collapse around her like a house of cards in a hurricane. Victoria Hartwell had built her entire identity around control. Growing up in a trailer park in rural Georgia, she had learned early that respect wasn't given, it was taken. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Atlanta, coming home each night with stories about marble bathrooms bigger than their entire mobile home and closets full of clothes that cost more than they made in a year. Someday, her mother would say, scrubbing Victoria's school uniform in their tiny sink, "You'll have nice things too, but you'll have to fight for them. The world doesn't give anything to people like us." Victoria had taken that lesson to heart. She'd fought her way through community college studying hospitality management while working 3 jobs. She'd endured years of entitled passengers treating her like she was invisible, learning to smile while they complained about everything from the temperature of their drinks to the angle of their seats. She'd watched younger, prettier girls get promoted while she remained stuck in economy service serving peanuts to people who wouldn't even make eye contact with her. But Victoria was patient. She was strategic. And most importantly, she was ruthless when opportunity presented itself. When senior purser Margaret Reynolds retired unexpectedly after a heart attack, Victoria was ready. She had documentation on every crew member's minor infractions, stellar performance reviews she'd carefully cultivated. And most importantly, she had leverage on Captain James Mitchell that ensured his unwavering support for her promotion. Now, standing in the first-class galley of Meridian Flight 447, Victoria surveyed her domain with satisfaction. This was her cabin, her rules, her kingdom at 35,000 feet. The first passengers began boarding, and Victoria activated her professional smile, the one she'd practiced in mirrors until it looked genuine even when her eyes remained cold. First came the usual suspects, tired businessmen in $1,000 suits, tech executives clutching their MacBooks like security blankets, and the occasional celebrity trying to maintain anonymity behind oversized sunglasses and designer face masks. Then came Diana Pemberton, and Victoria's smile became genuine for the first time that day. Mrs. Diana Pemberton was everything Victoria aspired to be. 65 years old, with silver hair styled in an elegant bob, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from generational wealth. Her Hermes bag probably cost more than Victoria made in 3 months, and her jewelry, real diamonds, real pearls, real everything, caught the cabin lights like tiny stars. Victoria Darling Diana's voice carried the refined cadence of private schools and country club memberships. "How lovely to see you again. I specifically requested this flight when I saw you were working. Mrs. Pemberton, what a pleasure." Victoria's voice took on a different quality when speaking to passengers like Diana, softer, more deferential, but still maintaining an air of professional competence. "Your usual seat in 2B is ready, and I've already chilled your preferred champagne." "Wonderful. I do hope we won't have any disruptions today. Last month's flight was quite unpleasant. Some people simply don't understand that certain standards should be maintained." Diana's pale blue eyes swept the cabin with the practiced judgment of someone accustomed to evaluating people's worth at a glance. "I completely understand, Mrs. Pemberton. I can assure you that won't be an issue today. I personally oversee the boarding process to ensure our first-class cabin maintains its exclusive atmosphere." Diana smiled and settled into her seat, immediately pulling out her phone to document her luxurious surroundings for her social media followers. She had over 50,000 Instagram followers who lived vicariously through her lifestyle posts, and she never missed an opportunity to showcase her privileged existence. Meanwhile, Elena Rodriguez watched the interaction from the galley with growing unease. She'd been flying for 5 years, working her way up from regional carriers to Meridian's international routes, and she'd seen Victoria's particular brand of passenger management before. It always made her stomach clench with anxiety. Elena had grown up in a working-class family in Phoenix, the daughter of immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they'd never had. Her father worked construction, her mother cleaned office buildings at night. Elena understood what it meant to be judged by your appearance, to be dismissed because you didn't fit someone else's image of who belonged in certain spaces. But she also understood what it meant to need this job. Single mother, student loans, rent, in an expensive city she couldn't afford to rock the boat, no matter how uncomfortable Victoria's methods made her feel. As more passengers boarded, Elena busied herself with pre-flight preparations, trying to ignore the way Victoria's eyes tracked certain passengers with predatory focus. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the slight narrowing of Victoria's eyes when she spotted someone who didn't meet her unspoken criteria, the way her smile became sharper, more calculating. Captain James Mitchell, a 42-year-old career pilot with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, emerged from the cockpit for his pre-flight passenger greeting. He nodded to Victoria with professional courtesy, but there was something else in his expression, a tension that suggested their relationship extended beyond normal crew dynamics. "Everything under control back here?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Always, Captain Mitchell. We should have a smooth boarding process today." Victoria's response carried multiple layers of meaning, and the captain's slight nod suggested he understood perfectly. Dr. Michael Foster, settling into seat 4. Hay glanced up from his medical journal as the crew interaction played out. A trauma surgeon at Emory University Hospital, he'd developed a keen eye for reading people under pressure. Something about the flight attendant's demeanor, the controlled aggression, the way she watched certain passengers, reminded him of the power dynamics he'd witnessed in hospital hierarchies. Not always healthy, not always ethical. He made a mental note to pay attention during the flight. In his experience, people who craved control this intensely often revealed their true nature when that control was challenged. The boarding process continued, each passenger adding to the complex social ecosystem of the cabin. Business travelers focused on their laptops, families juggling carry-on bags, and tired children, elderly passengers moving slowly down the aisle with careful dignity. And then, at 2:47 p.m., everything changed. A young woman stepped through the aircraft door, and Victoria Hartwell's predatory instincts immediately locked onto her target. Zara Blackwell moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that she didn't need to announce her worth, it spoke for itself. At 22, she possessed an understated elegance that had nothing to do with designer labels and everything to do with self-possession. Her vintage Nirvana t-shirt was soft from years of wear, her jeans artfully distressed in the way that suggested authenticity rather than expensive manufacturing. Canvas Converse sneakers, paint-stained and comfortable, completed her look. Her natural hair was twisted into a loose bun, secured with what appeared to be a paintbrush, and she carried a worn leather messenger bag that looked like it had traveled the world. To Victoria Hartwell's eyes, she looked like everything that was wrong with modern air travel. Zara paused at the entrance to the aircraft, pulling her phone from her pocket to check a text message. The movement caused her messenger bag to shift, revealing the corner of what appeared to be an art portfolio and several expensive-looking brushes. She smiled at whatever message she'd received, her face lighting up with a genuine warmth, completely oblivious to the predatory gaze tracking her every movement. She turned left into the first-class cabin. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around her tablet. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd been describing to Elena, someone who clearly didn't belong trying to infiltrate the premium cabin, probably a college student with a fake boarding pass, or maybe an economy passenger who'd gotten confused in the boarding process. Either way, it was Victoria's job to maintain order. She stepped directly into the aisle, her body language shifting into what she privately called her enforcement mode. Spine, straight chin, raised expression, professional but unmistakably authoritative. She'd perfected this stance over years of dealing with difficult passengers, and it rarely failed to establish immediate dominance. "Excuse me." Miss Victoria's voice carried clearly through the cabin, pitched just loud enough to ensure other passengers would witness her professional handling of the situation. "I believe you may be turned around. The economy cabin is through the main galley past the business class section. Zara looked up from her phone, amber eyes focusing on Victoria with mild curiosity rather than the immediate deference Victoria expected. She was prettier than Victoria had initially realized, the kind of natural beauty that didn't require enhancement, which somehow made Victoria's irritation sharpen. "I'm sorry." Zara's voice carried a slight southern accent, cultured but warm. The kind of accent that suggested private schools and summer homes, which only increased Victoria's suspicion. Rich kids playing dress-up pretending to be bohemian while their trust funds paid for first-class tickets. The economy section, Victoria repeated, her smile becoming more pronounced. It's easy to get confused when boarding. The first-class cabin is reserved for passengers with premium tickets. She gestured toward the back of the plane with the kind of theatrical politeness that barely concealed condescension. Zara's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that suggested this wasn't her first encounter with this particular type of assumption. "I appreciate your concern," Zara said, her voice remaining level and pleasant, "but I'm exactly where I need to be." She reached into her messenger bag and pulled out her boarding pass, extending it toward Victoria without defensiveness or apology. The gesture was simple matter of fact, as if she were showing identification to enter a museum rather than defending her right to exist in a particular space. Victoria took the boarding pass, her eyes scanning it with the kind of intensity usually reserved for suspicious documents at border crossings. Zara Blackwell, Seat 2A. The first-class designation was clearly printed, the Meridian Airlines logo authentic, the paper quality suggesting it had been printed from their premium reservation system rather than a budget third-party site. But something about it felt wrong to Victoria. Maybe it was the name Blackwell, which didn't appear on her mental list of frequent first-class passengers. Maybe it was the contradiction between Zara's appearance and the expensive seat assignment. Or maybe it was simply that Victoria's worldview required certain people to stay in certain places, and this young woman was disrupting that carefully maintained order. Blackwell Victoria said the name aloud as if testing its validity. "I don't recognize that name from our elite frequent flyer list. Are you perhaps traveling on an employee standby pass? Those are subject to specific dress code requirements." The question hung in the air like smoke. Several passengers had now turned their attention to the interaction, their conversations pausing as they recognized the subtle drama unfolding in the aisle. Diana Pemberton lowered her reading glasses, watching with the kind of interested detachment of someone observing a reality TV show. Dr. Foster glanced up from his journal, his trained eye immediately recognizing the power dynamics at play. He'd seen similar scenarios in hospital settings, senior staff challenging junior colleagues based on assumptions rather than facts, using authority as a weapon rather than a tool for fairness. Elena Rodriguez felt her stomach clench as she watched from the galley. She could see where this was heading, had witnessed Victoria's particular brand of passenger management before. The public questioning, the subtle humiliation, the gradual escalation until the passenger either submitted to Victoria's authority or found themselves removed from the flight entirely. Zara's response surprised everyone. She smiled. Not the nervous, apologetic smile of someone caught in an uncomfortable situation, but the genuine, slightly amused smile of someone who found the entire interaction rather quaint. "It's a paid ticket," she said simply, reaching out to take her boarding pass back. "Full fare, actually, and I'd appreciate it if I could get settled in my seat." It's been a long day. The simplicity of her response somehow made it more powerful. No defensiveness, no anger. No attempt to justify her presence beyond the basic fact that she'd purchased the right to be there. The calm confidence in her voice suggested this wasn't a debate in her mind. It was a statement of fact. Victoria felt something she rarely experienced any more: uncertainty. In her carefully constructed hierarchy of air travel passengers who looked like Zara didn't speak with this kind of quiet authority. They became flustered, apologetic, grateful for any accommodation she might deign to offer. They didn't smile like they knew something she didn't. "I understand. You believe you have a valid ticket," Victoria said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "But as senior purser, I have the responsibility to verify all first-class passenger credentials. There have been several instances recently of fraudulent boarding passes being used to access premium cabins. This was a lie, but Victoria had learned that invoking security concerns gave her almost unlimited authority to question passengers. Airlines had become increasingly paranoid about fraud, and crew members were encouraged to err on the side of caution when something seemed suspicious. "Then verify it," Zara said, her smile never wavering. "Check your passenger manifest, call your supervisor, run whatever security protocols you need. I'll wait." The response caught Victoria off guard. Most passengers would have become defensive at this point, would have started explaining themselves or producing additional identification. Zara's complete lack of concern suggested either supreme confidence or supreme naivety, and Victoria wasn't sure which possibility was more irritating. Diana Pemberton chose that moment to insert herself into the conversation. "Victoria, darling," her voice carried the kind of casual authority that came from decades of having her opinions matter. "Is there some sort of problem? I can feel a draft from the door. And frankly, this young lady is blocking my view of the safety demonstration." The comment was perfectly calculated, expressing concern for safety and procedures, while subtly suggesting that Zara's presence was disruptive to the cabin's normal order. Diana had perfected this kind of passive aggression through years of country club politics and charity board meetings. Zara turned to look at Diana, her expression remaining pleasant, but somehow becoming more focused. When she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, still warm but with underlying steel. "I apologize if my existence is inconvenient for you," she said. "I'm sure we can all manage to coexist peacefully for the next few hours." The word choice was deliberate. Existence rather than presence. It suggested that Diana's objection wasn't to Zara's behavior but to her fundamental right to occupy space in the cabin. It was a subtle linguistic jujitsu move that turned Diana's casual racism back on itself without ever explicitly acknowledging what had just happened. Doctor. Foster felt his medical training kick in the ability to recognize patterns, to see connections that others missed. This young woman wasn't just defending herself. She was conducting a masterclass in maintaining dignity under pressure. Her responses were too measured, too strategic for someone who was simply trying to get to her seat. She was making a point about something larger than boarding passes and seat assignments. Elena watched from the galley, torn between admiration for Zara's composure and anxiety about what Victoria might do next. She'd seen her supervisor's reaction when passengers didn't immediately defer to her authority, and it was never pretty. Victoria felt the situation slipping away from her control. The young woman's calm confidence was starting to make her own behavior seem excessive even to herself. But backing down now would undermine her authority in front of the other passengers, would suggest that her initial suspicions had been unfounded. She made a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to need to see additional identification," Victoria announced, her voice becoming more official. "And I'll need to manually verify your ticket against our passenger manifest. Please step aside while I resolve this issue." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the full weight of her authority as senior purser. In Victoria's experience, this was usually where passengers either complied or made themselves look unreasonable by refusing to cooperate with basic security procedures. Zara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it briefly, and for just a moment her smile became something else entirely. Not amused, not pleasant, but satisfied in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Of course," she said, stepping slightly to the side but not leaving the first-class cabin. "Take all the time you need." The words were perfectly reasonable, but somehow they sounded like a challenge, like someone dealing cards who already knew the hand they'd been dealt was a royal flush. Victoria didn't realize it yet, but she'd just made the biggest mistake of her career. 6 years earlier, 16-year-old Zara Blackwell had walked into the Whitfield Gallery in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood, wearing paint-stained jeans and a thrift store sweater, her natural hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She'd saved for 3 months to buy a single piece from their emerging artists' collection, a small abstract painting that spoke to something deep in her soul. The gallery owner, Richard Whitfield III, had followed her around the pristine white space like she was planning to steal something. His eyes tracked her every movement, his body language screaming discomfort at her presence in his carefully curated environment. When she finally approached him about purchasing the piece, he'd actually laughed. "Sweetheart, that painting costs $3,200. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable looking at our print reproductions. They're much more affordable." The condescension in his voice had burned, but not in the way he'd intended. Instead of shame, Zara had felt something crystallize inside her, a cold, clear understanding of how the world worked and how she would choose to move through it. She'd pulled out an envelope containing $3,400 in cash birthday money from her grandmother, earnings from her part-time job at an art supply store, and every spare dollar she'd saved over the past year. She'd counted it out slowly on his glass counter, never breaking eye contact. "I'll take the painting," she'd said quietly, "and I'd like it delivered to this address." She'd written down the address of the most exclusive private school in Boston where she was a scholarship student. "Tell them it's for the headmaster's office." Richard Whitfield III had completed the sale in stunned silence, his worldview shifting slightly on its axis. The girl who'd looked so out of place had just spent more money than most of his regular customers dropped in a single visit. But the real lesson hadn't been about money. It had been about power, specifically the power that came from letting people underestimate you and then showing them who you really were. That lesson had served Zara well through her years at Rhode Island School of Design, where she'd learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of art school politics. Trust fund kids assumed she was there on scholarship, which was partially true, and treated her like their token diverse friend. Professors made assumptions about her background and interests based on her appearance. Gallery owners at student shows directed their attention to her white classmates, assuming they were the serious buyers. Each time, Zara had responded with the same quiet dignity she'd learned at 16. Let them reveal their biases. Let them show their true character, and then, when the moment was right, show them exactly who they were dealing with. Now, standing in the first-class cabin of Meridian Flight 447, she recognized the familiar pattern playing out. Victoria Hartwell was just another Richard Whitfield III, another person whose worldview required certain people to stay in certain places. The difference was that this time Zara wasn't a teenager saving birthday money. This time she had resources that even she didn't fully understand yet. Her phone buzzed again and she glanced at the screen. Another message from her father. "Delayed 20 minutes. Don't let them move you. The cavalry is coming." Marcus Blackwell had started with nothing and built Meridian Airlines from a single-route regional carrier into one of the most successful airlines in the country. He'd faced his own share of assumptions and discrimination along the way. Boardrooms where he was the only black-face business meetings where people assumed he was the assistant rather than the CEO, country clubs where membership applications mysteriously disappeared. But he'd learned something important about power. The most effective way to wield it was quietly, strategically, and with devastating precision when the moment demanded it. When Zara had called him 20 minutes earlier to report the situation developing on his own airline, his response had been immediate and surgical. Private car dispatched to the airport, security clearance arranged, and most importantly, complete documentation of everything that was about to unfold. Because Marcus Blackwell understood something that Victoria Hartwell was about to learn. The hard way, discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was also incredibly expensive when it happened to the wrong person. Meanwhile, Victoria was experiencing her own moment of twisted nostalgia. Watching Zara stand confidently in the first-class aisle reminded her of every privileged student who'd attended the private school where her mother had worked as a janitor. She remembered hiding in supply closets when the rich kids would mock the help, making cruel jokes about the cleaning lady's daughter who thought she belonged in their world. Those memories had fueled her ambition but also poisoned it. Success for Victoria wasn't just about achieving comfort and security, it was about having the power to make others feel the way she'd been made to feel. It was about being the gatekeeper instead of the one seeking entrance. She didn't realize that her desire for power had blinded her to the most important rule of wielding it. Effectively, always know exactly who you're dealing with before you make your move. Elena Rodriguez watched the standoff developing with growing anxiety. She'd grown up understanding the delicate balance of staying invisible while doing your job of not drawing attention that might cost you the opportunities you'd worked so hard to earn. Her parents had sacrificed everything to give their children a chance at the American dream, and she couldn't risk losing her position over a passenger dispute. But something about Zara's composure troubled her. Most passengers faced with Victoria's aggressive questioning either became defensive or apologetic. Zara seemed almost pleased by the attention, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. Dr. Foster had stopped pretending to read his medical journal and was now openly observing the interaction. His experience in emergency medicine had taught him to recognize situations that were about to escalate beyond anyone's control. The flight attendant's body language showed increasing agitation, while the passenger remained unnaturally calm. In his experience, that combination usually meant someone had information that others didn't. Diana Pemberton adjusted her pearls and settled deeper into her seat, preparing to enjoy what she assumed would be the inevitable removal of the inappropriately dressed young woman. She'd witnessed similar scenes before, and always found them satisfying, a confirmation that proper standards still mattered, that there were still consequences for people who didn't know their place. None of them understood that they were witnessing the opening moves of a chess game where only one player knew all the pieces on the board. Zara's phone buzzed once more. This time, her smile became genuinely warm as she read the message, ETA 5 minutes. Dad. She looked up at Victoria, who was still scrutinizing the boarding pass like it might confess to fraud if she stared at it long enough. Finding everything in order, Zara asked pleasantly. The question was innocent enough, but something in her tone made Victoria's jaw clench. There was an undertone of amusement, as if this entire situation was somehow entertaining rather than serious. As if Victoria's authority was a joke rather than a legitimate exercise of professional responsibility. "I'm being thorough," Victoria replied stiffly. "Security is everyone's priority these days." "Absolutely," Zara agreed. "I imagine my father would be very interested to know how seriously Meridian Airlines takes passenger security. He's quite invested in the company's reputation." The comment seemed innocuous, but Victoria felt a small flutter of unease. Something about the way Zara had said invested suggested more than casual concern, but before she could analyze the feeling further, her tablet chimed with an incoming message from the gate agent. As she read the text, her face went pale, then flushed red with anger. The cavalry wasn't coming. It had arrived. Doctor. Michael Foster had seen enough trauma cases to recognize when a situation was about to go from bad to catastrophic. The flight attendant's increasing agitation, combined with the passenger's supernatural calm, created a dynamic that reminded him of the moments just before a patient coded, when all the warning signs were there. But most people weren't trained to see them. He discreetly activated his phone's camera, positioning it to capture the interaction without being obvious about recording. As a trauma surgeon, he'd learned that objective documentation often revealed truths that eyewitness testimony missed. People saw what they expected to see, heard what they wanted to hear. Video didn't lie. The young woman Zara, according to the boarding pass discussion, had said something about her father being invested in the airline's reputation. The way she'd said it suggested more than typical passenger concern. Doctor. Foster had spent enough time around hospital administrators to recognize the subtle confidence that came from having connections others didn't know about. Elena Rodriguez felt her hands trembling as she arranged champagne glasses in the galley. She'd witnessed Victoria's passenger confrontations before, but this felt different. Usually, passengers either backed down quickly or escalated to angry shouting. Zara's composed responses were clearly frustrating Victoria in ways that Elena had never seen before. Growing up in Phoenix, Elena had been the daughter who translated for her parents at parent-teacher conferences, who helped navigate insurance paperwork and job applications. She understood the exhausting burden of constantly proving you belonged in spaces where others took their presence for granted. But she also understood the dangerous reality of challenging people who held power over your livelihood. Still, something made her speak up. "Miss Hartwell," Elena's voice was quiet but clear. "The passenger manifest shows Miss Blackwell confirmed for seat 2A, paid in full, no restrictions." She held up her tablet, the screen displaying the official record. Victoria's eyes snapped to Elena with laser focus. "Did I ask for your input, Rodriguez?" The use of her last name instead of her first was deliberate, a subtle assertion of hierarchy that made Elena's cheeks burn. But she'd already spoken. Backing down now would only make things worse. "No, ma'am. I just thought you'd want to know the system shows everything in order." "The system can be manipulated," Victoria replied coldly. "That's why we conduct manual verification. Perhaps you'd benefit from additional training on security protocols." The threat was clear. Question Victoria's judgment and face consequences that could affect Elena's career prospects. But Dr. Foster caught Elena's eye and gave her an almost imperceptible nod of support, his phone still recording discreetly. Sarah Williams, the gate agent, had been monitoring the boarding process from her position at the jet bridge entrance. Through her headset, she'd heard the flight crews back and forth about the passenger in 2A, and something about the situation bothered her. She pulled up her computer system and ran Zara Blackwell's reservation details again. What she found made her stomach drop. The ticket wasn't just paid in full, it was purchased through Meridian's executive booking system, the kind of access that required specific authorization codes, the kind of booking that typically meant the passenger had connections to the airline's corporate structure. Sarah had seen these booking codes before, usually for board members, family members, or high-level executive travel. She grabbed her radio to alert the flight crew but paused when she saw a black Bentley approaching the aircraft on the tarmac below. Executive ground transport wasn't unusual at Hartsfield-Jackson, but something about this particular arrival caught her attention. Airport security was clearing a path, ground crew supervisors were gathering nearby, and the level of activity suggested someone very important was about to board. Diana Pemberton, meanwhile, was thoroughly enjoying what she perceived as entertainment. She'd positioned herself to have a clear view of the confrontation while maintaining plausible deniability about eavesdropping. Her phone was discreetly recording as well, though her intentions were less noble than Dr. Foster's. She planned to share the drama with her social media followers as an example of declining standards in air travel. "I do hope this resolves quickly," she commented loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Some people simply don't understand that first-class service requires maintaining certain standards." The comment was designed to provide social pressure for Zara to accept reassignment to economy, to acknowledge that she didn't belong among Diana's class of passenger. Instead, Zara turned to face Diana directly. "I couldn't agree more about standards." Zara said, her voice pleasant but her eyes sharp, though I suspect we might define them differently. The response was perfectly polite, but it carried an unmistakable challenge. Diana felt herself flush, unsure whether she'd just been insulted or agreed with. Before she could formulate a response, her attention was drawn to activity outside the aircraft windows. A small convoy of airport vehicles was approaching the plane ground crew trucks, a security escort, and most prominently the black Bentley that seemed to command everyone's attention. Diana pulled out her reading glasses to get a better look, her social media instincts recognizing a potentially significant development. Inside the cabin, the tension was becoming palpable. Other passengers had begun to notice the standoff in the aisle, conversations dying down as people focused on the drama unfolding in first class. A few had their phones out recording what they assumed would be the eventual removal of the inappropriately dressed passenger. Zara checked her phone again and smiled, the first completely genuine expression of pleasure she'd shown since boarding. Whatever message she'd received had clearly been welcome news. "Miss Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying a new note of anticipation, "I believe your verification process is about to become much simpler." Victoria frowned, unsure what that meant, but not liking the confidence in Zara's voice. She was about to demand clarification when Captain James Mitchell's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a brief delay before pushback. Please remain seated while we handle some last-minute passenger boarding. The announcement was unusual. Flights rarely accommodated late passengers once boarding was complete. Victoria felt a flutter of unease, but told herself it was probably just another entitled businessman who'd missed his connection and pulled strings to make the flight wait. Elena glanced out the galley window and gasped softly. She recognized the man stepping out of the Bentley from Meridian's corporate newsletter, a tall, distinguished black man in an expensive but understated suit who carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people step aside without being asked. Dr. Foster followed Elena's gaze and felt the pieces of the puzzle suddenly click into place. He'd seen that same quiet confidence in Zara's demeanor, the same sense of someone who was used to being in control of situations, even when they appeared vulnerable. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. The commanding general had personally taken the field, and Victoria Hartwell was about to discover that some battles can't be won because you never had the authority to fight them in the first place. Victoria Hartwell's tablet chimed with another notification, this one from the aircraft's internal communication system. Captain Mitchell was requesting her immediate presence in the cockpit for passenger verification issues. The formal language suggested this was no longer a routine boarding dispute. It had escalated to something requiring official documentation. Perfect, Victoria thought. Now she could resolve this situation properly with full backing from the flight crew and clear documentation of the security protocols she'd followed. She'd been in similar situations before, and they always ended the same way. The inappropriately placed passenger was quietly reassigned to their proper seat, order was restored, and her authority was reinforced. "Miss Rodriguez," she said to Elena, her voice carrying the crisp authority of command. "Please escort Miss Blackwell to economy seating while I verify her ticket status with the captain. Use seat 23F. It's a window seat which should be adequate accommodation for any legitimate booking issues." Elena's stomach clenched. She'd seen Victoria use this tactic before, physically relocate the passenger before completing verification, making it harder for them to argue their way back to their original seat. Once someone was settled in economy, flight crew were less likely to disrupt the cabin again by moving them back to first class, regardless of what the verification revealed. "Ma'am," Elena said carefully, "shouldn't we complete the verification before? Did I ask for your opinion on procedures?" Victoria's voice cut through the cabin like a whip crack. "Follow my instructions, or we'll be having a conversation with crew management about your ability to follow direct orders." The threat hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Elena's job, her health insurance, her ability to support herself, all of it balanced on Victoria's evaluation of her performance. She looked helplessly at Zara, who gave her a small, understanding nod. "It's all right," Zara said quietly. "Do what you need to do. I understand your position." But instead of moving toward economy, Zara settled more firmly into seat 2A, pulling out her phone with the casual confidence of someone who knew backup was coming. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, sending a rapid series of text messages. Victoria felt her carefully maintained control begin to slip. "Miss Blackwell, I've asked you to temporarily relocate while we resolve the verification issue. Refusing to comply with crew instructions is a federal offense." "I'm not refusing anything," Zara replied, calmly, not looking up from her phone. "I'm waiting for your verification to be completed as requested. Since this is my assigned seat and I have a valid boarding pass, I see no reason to relocate during your administrative process." The logic was unassailable, but it directly challenged Victoria's authority in front of the other passengers. Dr. Foster continued recording, discreetly recognizing that this exchange was revealing something important about both women's understanding of power dynamics. Diana Pemberton shifted in her seat, her enjoyment of the situation beginning to transform into impatience. "Victoria, surely this can be resolved without disrupting the entire first-class cabin. Some of us have connecting flights to consider." Victoria seized on Diana's comment as validation of her position. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Pemberton. One passenger's refusal to cooperate shouldn't inconvenience our valued premium customers." She turned back to Zara with renewed confidence. "Final request, Miss Blackwell. Please relocate to economy while verification is completed. Zara looked up from her phone, and for the first time since boarding, her smile had an edge to it. And if I refuse, then we'll have to involve airport security to resolve the situation. Security. Zara repeated the word thoughtfully, as if considering its implications. That's interesting. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what exactly would you report to security? That a passenger with a valid boarding pass is sitting in their assigned seat. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria felt her face flush as she realized the logical flaw in her position. What exactly would she tell security? That she suspected fraud based on what the passenger's appearance? Her clothing choices. The fact that she didn't recognize the name from the frequent flyer list I would report. Victoria said carefully that a passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions during a routine security verification. Which instructions specifically? Zara's voice remained pleasant, but her questions were becoming more pointed. The instruction to leave my assigned seat without cause. The instruction to accept inferior accommodations while you conduct an investigation that could be completed in 30 seconds. By checking your computer system, Dr. Foster found himself impressed despite the situation. Zara wasn't just defending herself, she was methodically exposing the arbitrariness of Victoria's demands. Like a skilled attorney cross-examining a hostile witness, she was forcing Victoria to articulate the logic behind her actions. Elena watched from the galley, torn between admiration for Zara's composure and anxiety about what Victoria might do when cornered. She'd seen her supervisor's reactions when passengers didn't immediately defer to her authority, and it rarely ended well. Elena Victoria snapped, turning toward the galley. Pull up the passenger manifest on your tablet. I want to see Miss Blackwell's complete booking information. Elena reluctantly accessed the system, her fingers trembling slightly as she navigated to Zara's reservation. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The booking wasn't just confirmed, it was flagged with a VIP designation she'd never seen before. The ticket price was higher than she'd expected even for first class. And most significantly, the booking reference code began with EB, the prefix reserved for executive board family members. Miss Hartwell, Elena said quietly, hoping to prevent the situation from escalating further. The passenger information shows, read it aloud. Victoria interrupted, confidence returning. If the booking showed anything irregular, having Elena announce it publicly would justify her suspicions and demonstrate proper security protocols. Elena's eyes flicked between her screen and Zara's calm expression. Passenger name Blackwell Zara. Seat assignment 2A. Booking status confirmed. Ticket price $8,400. Booking reference EB 7749. Special services VIP ground transport priority boarding executive lounge access. The silence that followed Elena's reading was profound. $8,000 was well above the usual first-class fare, suggesting either a last-minute booking or premium service level. The VIP designation was something Victoria had rarely seen, typically reserved for airline executives, major shareholders, or their family members. Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Booking codes can be manipulated, she said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. I've seen sophisticated fraud schemes that replicate official reservation systems. Zara's phone buzzed again. This time, when she read the message, her smile became positively radiant. Actually, she said, standing gracefully from her seat, I think your verification process is about to become much more straightforward. My father just arrived. Through the aircraft windows, Elena could see the black Bentley that had approached the plane. Airport ground crew were positioning mobile stairs, and security personnel were forming a corridor from the vehicle to the aircraft entrance. The level of protocol was extraordinary, suggesting someone of significant importance was boarding. Victoria felt a chill of unease, but forced herself to maintain professional composure. Wealthy passengers often had connections that could complicate routine security procedures, but she'd dealt with entitled travelers before. Whatever influence Zara's father might have, proper protocol still had to be followed. I look forward to meeting him, Victoria said, her voice regaining some of its earlier authority. Perhaps he can explain how his daughter obtained access to premium seating without following standard booking procedures. Dr. Foster glanced out the window and felt his medical training kick in, the ability to diagnose what others missed, to see patterns that weren't immediately obvious. The ground crew's behavior, the security escort, the deliberate care with which they were handling the approaching passenger's arrival. This wasn't the treatment given to even very wealthy customers. This was the treatment reserved for owners. Diana Pemberton had stopped recording and was now staring out the window with growing unease. In her decades of first-class travel, she'd never seen this level of ground protocol for a passenger boarding. Something about the situation was making her reconsider her earlier assumptions about the young woman in Seat 2A. Zara remained standing, smoothing down her vintage t-shirt with casual grace. "I should probably warn you," she said to Victoria, her voice maintaining its pleasant tone. "My father takes customer service very seriously. He's particularly interested in how passengers are treated based on their appearance, rather than their actual status." The comment landed like a small bomb in the cabin. Several passengers exchanged glances, beginning to understand that this situation might be more complex than they'd initially assumed. Victoria felt sweat beginning to form along her hairline, despite the cabin's controlled temperature. Something about Zara's confidence, combined with the extraordinary ground protocol happening outside, was triggering alarm bells she couldn't ignore. But backing down now would undermine everything she'd built her professional identity around. "Regardless of your family connections," Victoria said, her voice becoming more formal, "security protocols exist for everyone's protection. I've followed proper procedures in questioning suspicious booking activity." Suspicious based on what criteria? Zara asked, her amber eyes focusing on Victoria with laser intensity. The question was simple, but it went straight to the heart of the matter. Victoria realized she was about to be forced to articulate exactly why she'd found Zara's presence in first class suspicious, and every honest answer would reveal the bias that had driven her actions from the moment Zara had stepped aboard. As she struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't explicitly reveal her prejudices, the aircraft door opened and Marcus Blackwell stepped inside. The atmosphere in the cabin changed instantly, like the pressure drop that precedes a thunderstorm. Here was a man accustomed to command someone whose presence shifted the gravity of every space he entered. His suit was impeccably tailored but understated, his bearing confident without being aggressive, his eyes taking in the entire scene with the quick assessment of someone used to managing complex situations. When his gaze settled on his daughter's handcuffed wrists, something dangerous flickered in his expression. Victoria was about to discover that some mistakes can't be explained away, no matter how carefully you choose your words. In the moment before Marcus Blackwell's arrival became apparent to the cabin, Victoria Hartwell made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Faced with the growing realization that she might have misjudged the situation rather than backing down gracefully, she doubled down with the desperation of someone who understood that her authority was slipping away. "Mrs. Pemberton," Victoria said, her voice carrying across the first-class cabin with renewed confidence. "I notice your diamond tennis bracelet is missing from your seat. When did you last see it?" Diana Pemberton looked confused, glancing down at her wrist where a different bracelet, sapphires and gold, gleamed in the cabin lighting. "I'm sorry. What tennis bracelet? I'm not wearing." "The one you were admiring earlier," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "The one with the Cartier clasp that you mentioned was a gift from your late husband. I noticed it when you boarded." Dr. Foster felt his blood pressure spike as he watched Victoria's performance. As a trauma surgeon, he'd learned to recognize dangerous pathology when he saw it, and what he was witnessing now was someone manufacturing evidence in real time. His phone continued recording, capturing every word, every gesture, every telltale sign of a fabricated story. Diana, despite her confusion, was socially conditioned to defer to authority figures, especially when they spoke with such certainty. "Oh," she said hesitantly, Well, if you say I had it, then perhaps I misplaced it somewhere." "That's very troubling," Victoria said, her voice taking on the grave tone of someone discovering a serious security breach. theft on aircraft is a federal crime. We'll need to conduct an immediate search of all passengers and their belongings." Elena Rodriguez watched in horror from the galley as Victoria pulled her own tennis bracelet from her pocket, the one she'd worn to work that morning and removed before the flight as per regulation. With practiced sleight of hand, Victoria approached Zara's messenger bag, which hung from the armrest of seat 2A. "Miss Blackwell, Victoria," said her voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "I'm going to need to search your bag for the missing jewelry. This is standard protocol for theft investigations." Zara looked up from her phone with mild interest as if watching a particularly engaging magic trick. "Of course," she said. "Though I'm curious why you'd suspect me specifically when there are 30 other passengers in this cabin." The question was perfectly reasonable, but Victoria was committed to her course of action now. Suspicious behavior patterns, she replied, unzipping Zara's bag and beginning to rummage through art supplies, books, and personal items. Passengers exhibiting deceptive booking practices often engage in other criminal activities. Dr. Foster felt sick as he watched Victoria plant the bracelet deep inside Zara's bag beneath a portfolio of artwork and a small makeup case. The motion was swift and practiced, suggesting this wasn't the first time Victoria had used such tactics to resolve challenging passengers. "Here we are," Victoria announced, pulling the bracelet from Zara's bag with theatrical surprise. "Mrs. Pemberton, can you identify this as your missing jewelry?" Diana squinted at the bracelet, her confusion deepening. The piece was beautiful, but wasn't anything she recognized. However, surrounded by official accusations and Victoria's confident presentation of evidence, she found herself nodding uncertainly. Yes, it could be. I mean, if you found it in her bag." Elena's hands trembled as she realized what she was witnessing. Victoria had just planted evidence and coerced a false identification from a confused, elderly passenger. This wasn't passenger management. This was criminal behavior disguised as a security protocol. Zara's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of shock, denial, or anger, she began to laugh. Not hysterical laughter, but genuine amusement, as if Victoria had just told an exceptionally clever joke. "That's very impressive sleight of hand," Zara said, her voice warm with appreciation. "Did you learn that in flight attendant training, or is it a personal hobby?" Victoria's face flushed red. "Are you accusing me of planting evidence? That's a serious allegation to make without proof." "Oh, I'm not making any allegations," Zara replied, settling back into her seat with obvious enjoyment. "I'm just admiring your technique, though you might want to consider that several people have been recording this interaction, and they captured some very interesting camera angles." Dr. Foster held up his phone slightly, making sure Victoria could see that he'd been filming. Other passengers began checking their own devices, realizing they might have captured something significant. Victoria felt panic beginning to claw at her chest, but she was too far committed to her course of action to stop now. "Passengers are not permitted to record during security investigations," she snapped. "All devices must be surrendered immediately." "Actually," came a new voice from the aircraft entrance, "I'd like to see those recordings myself." The entire first-class cabin turned toward the voice. Marcus Blackwell stood in the doorway, his presence immediately dominating the space. He wasn't a large man, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight. Behind him, Elena could see airport security personnel and what appeared to be airline executives gathering in the jet bridge. Victoria felt her world beginning to tilt on its axis, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. "Sir, we're conducting a theft investigation. I'll need to ask you to return to the boarding area until we've completed our security protocols." Marcus stepped fully into the cabin, his eyes taking in the scene with methodical precision. His daughter looking remarkably composed despite being accused of theft. A flight attendant holding a bracelet with obvious agitation. Other passengers with phones out recording what appeared to be a significant confrontation. "I see," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of calm that preceded storms. "And what exactly has been stolen?" Victoria straightened her shoulders, drawing on 15 years of authority in aircraft cabins. "This passenger," she gestured toward Zara, "has been caught with a diamond bracelet belonging to Mrs. Pemberton. We found it in her personal bag during a security search. Marcus looked at Diana Pemberton, who was beginning to appear increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. Mrs. Pemberton, can you describe this bracelet that was stolen from you? Diana fidgeted with her hands, her earlier certainty evaporating under direct questioning. Well, it was diamonds and gold, and I'm not entirely certain I was wearing it today, actually. But you identified it as yours when Miss Hartwell presented it to you. She seemed so certain, and with all the official procedures. Diana's voice trailed off as she realized how weak her identification sounded. Dr. Foster stepped forward, holding his phone. Sir, I have video evidence of this entire interaction, including the moment the bracelet was placed in the passenger's bag. Would you like me to transfer it to airline security? Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. This passenger is attempting to interfere with a federal investigation. Security footage taken without consent is inadmissible as evidence. Marcus smiled for the first time since boarding, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Actually, Miss Hartwell passengers have every right to document their interactions with airline personnel, especially when those interactions involve accusations of criminal behavior. He turned to Elena, who had been watching the exchange with growing horror. Miss Rodriguez, isn't it Elena Rodriguez from Phoenix 5 years with Meridian excellent performance reviews, except for some concerns about following unconventional passenger management directives? Elena's eyes widened in surprise. How did he know her performance history? Yes, sir. Did you witness the search of this passenger's bag? Elena looked between Marcus and Victoria, understanding that her next words would determine her future with the airline. Yes, sir. I saw Miss Hartwell approach the bag, and I saw her remove the bracelet from it. But did you see the bracelet go into the bag initially? Elena took a deep breath, knowing there was no going back from this moment. No, sir. But I did see Miss Hartwell remove a bracelet from her own pocket just before conducting the search. Victoria felt the floor dropping away beneath her feet. That's a lie. Elena is obviously confused by the stress of the situation. Actually, Marcus said, pulling out his own phone, I think we can clear up any confusion quite easily. Officer Torres, could you join us, please? A uniformed airport police officer entered the cabin, his expression professional but concerned. Ryan Torres had been working airport security for 8 years, and he'd never been called onto an aircraft for a situation involving this level of management presence. Officer Torres Marcus continued, We have allegations of theft that need to be investigated. However, before we proceed, I think it's important that you understand who you're dealing with. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather credential case, opening it to reveal identification that made Officer Torres's eyes widen with recognition. Marcus Blackwell, CEO and majority shareholder of Meridian Airlines. The young woman being accused of theft is my daughter, Zara Blackwell. The employee making the accusations is Victoria Hartwell, one of our senior flight attendants, who appears to have engaged in evidence tampering to support false charges against a passenger. The revelation hit the cabin like a shockwave. Diana Pemberton's face went white as she realized she'd been manipulated into providing false identification. Other passengers began murmuring, understanding that they'd witnessed something far more serious than a routine theft investigation. Victoria felt reality crashing down around her. The CEO. She'd accused the CEO's daughter of theft, planted evidence, and coerced false testimony. 15 years of building her career gone in a single moment of terrible judgment. It's impossible, she whispered, but even as she said it, she could see the family resemblance now that she knew what to look for. The same quiet confidence, the same intelligent eyes, the same sense of controlled power. Officer Torres looked between the bracelet in Victoria's hand and the various phones still recording the interaction. Miss Hartwell, I'm going to need you to place that bracelet on the counter and step back. We need to sort out exactly what happened here before anyone gets arrested. But Zara spoke up from her seat, her voice carrying a note of finality that surprised everyone. Actually, Officer Torres, I think Miss Hartwell is the one who needs to be concerned about arrest. Planting evidence to support false criminal charges is a felony, last time I checked. And unlike her accusations against me, we have multiple witnesses and video evidence of what really happened." Victoria looked around the cabin, seeing her world crumbling in the faces of everyone present. The passengers who'd been recording Elena, whose testimony had destroyed her story; Diana, whose confused identification could no longer support her claims; and most terrifyingly, Marcus Blackwell, whose calm expression promised consequences she couldn't even imagine. In her desperation to maintain control, she'd picked a fight with the one family that had the power to destroy not just her career, but her entire life. And they had no intention of showing mercy. Marcus Blackwell had built his airline empire by understanding that true power wasn't about making noise, it was about making the right moves at exactly the right moment. As he stood in the first-class cabin of one of his own aircraft, watching his daughter handle false accusations with the grace he'd taught her, he felt a cold, calculating fury that was far more dangerous than any explosive anger. This wasn't just about discrimination against a passenger. This wasn't even just about the criminal behavior of planting evidence. This was about someone using his airline as a weapon against his family, and Marcus Blackwell had not clawed his way from a trailer park in Alabama to the executive suite of a major corporation by allowing such attacks to go unanswered. Officer Torres Marcus said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed before we proceed with any arrests. "I think it's important that everyone understands the full scope of what's happened here." He moved deeper into the cabin, his presence commanding attention from every passenger. Dr. Foster continued recording, recognizing that he was witnessing something that would likely become corporate legend. Elena Rodriguez stood frozen in the galley, understanding that her honest testimony had probably saved her career, but ended Victoria's. Ms. Hartwell Marcus continued addressing Victoria directly for the first time. "According to the testimony we've just heard, you removed a bracelet from your own pocket, planted it in my daughter's belongings, and then accused her of theft." Is that an accurate summary of events? Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Every instinct told her to deny the accusations, to maintain her authority, to claim that she was simply following security protocols. But faced with multiple witnesses, video evidence, and the man who literally signed her paychecks, the lies wouldn't come. There were suspicious circumstances. I was following proper security procedures." "Which procedures authorize planting evidence?" Marcus asked quietly. "I've read every training manual, every security protocol, every federal regulation governing airline personnel conduct. Please cite the specific procedure that permits framing passengers for theft." The question hung in the air like a sword. Victoria realized that any answer she gave would either admit to criminal behavior or prove ignorance of the regulations she claimed to be following. Zara watched her father work with professional admiration. This was why Marcus Blackwell had succeeded in the brutal world of airline management, not through anger or aggression, but through methodical dismantling of opposition, using facts, logic, and consequences. Dad Zara said quietly, "I think Miss Hartwell might be confused about what constitutes proper security protocol. Maybe she needs some additional training." The suggestion was delivered with perfect innocence, but everyone in the cabin understood the underlying message. Victoria's career in aviation was over, and the only question was whether she'd face criminal charges as well. Diana Pemberton, finally understanding that she'd been manipulated into supporting false charges, spoke up with the indignant fury of someone whose own reputation was now at stake. "I want it clearly understood that I never reported any missing jewelry," she announced loudly. "This woman," she pointed at Victoria, "told me I had lost a bracelet that I never owned. She pressured me into identifying property that wasn't mine. I've been deceived and used as an unwilling accomplice in this fraud." Her social status required distance from anything that might damage her reputation, and she was throwing Victoria overboard with the ruthless efficiency of someone protecting their position in elite circles. Officer Torres looked at the evidence mounting against Victoria, multiple witness statements, video documentation, and now the victim of the alleged theft claiming no crime had occurred. In his 8 years of airport security, he'd never seen a case collapse so completely and so quickly. "Miss Hartwell," he said formally, "I need you to place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for filing a false police report, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Victoria felt the handcuffs click around her wrists, the same handcuffs she'd watched being placed on Zara 30 minutes earlier. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Dr. Foster, whose recording would later show the exact moment when Victoria's face crumpled into the realization that her life as she'd known it was over. "This is a mistake," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to herself. "I was protecting the airline's interests. I was maintaining standards." Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that only Victoria could hear. "Miss Hartwell, in 30 years of business, I've learned that people who talk most loudly about maintaining standards are usually the ones most threatened by them. You saw my daughter's appearance and decided she didn't belong in first class. You made that decision based on bias, then manufactured evidence to support it when she refused to be bullied." He paused, studying her face with the clinical detachment of someone examining a failed business model. "But here's what you didn't understand. Real standards aren't about the cost of someone's clothes or the color of their skin. Real standards are about character integrity and treating people with dignity, regardless of how they look. By those standards, my daughter belongs anywhere she chooses to be, and you don't belong on my airline." Victoria was led away through the jet bridge past the gathered airline executives and security personnel who had assembled to witness her downfall. Elena Rodriguez watched her former supervisor disappear into custody, feeling a complex mixture of relief and sadness. Victoria had been a difficult boss, but watching anyone's life disintegrate was never pleasant. As the cabin began to settle, Marcus turned to address the other passengers who had witnessed the events. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that your flight has been disrupted by this incident. Meridian Airlines holds itself to the highest standards of passenger service, and what you witnessed today falls far short of those standards. We will be conducting a complete investigation into how such behavior was allowed to develop within our organization." Dr. Foster raised his hand slightly. "Mr. Blackwell, I have video documentation of the entire incident. I'd be happy to provide it to your investigation team. I appreciate that, Dr. Foster. Your evidence will be crucial in ensuring this situation is handled properly." Marcus's voice carried genuine gratitude. "Elena, could you join us for a moment?" Elena approached, nervously unsure whether she was about to be commended for her honesty or terminated for not intervening sooner. Elena Rodriguez Marcus said, consulting his phone where he'd apparently pulled up her personnel file, 5 years with Meridian, consistently high performance ratings, multiple commendations from passengers for exceptional service. "Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "And today you chose to tell the truth when doing so put your job at risk. That's the kind of character we need in leadership positions. Effective, immediately you're promoted to senior purser with a salary adjustment to reflect your new responsibilities. You'll also be working with our training department to develop new protocols for handling passenger disputes." Elena's eyes filled with tears of relief and gratitude. In 15 minutes, she'd gone from fearing for her job to receiving the promotion she'd been working toward for years. Diana Pemberton, meanwhile, was desperately trying to distance herself from the situation through social media posts, claiming she'd been victimized by a rogue airline employee and praising Meridian's swift action in resolving the crisis. Her followers would never know how eagerly she'd participated in the discrimination before learning Zara's true identity. As the cabin returned to normal boarding procedures, Zara looked up at her father with affection and amusement. "That was very impressive, Dad, though you might have gone a little easy on her." Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time since boarding. "Oh, we're not done yet. The criminal charges are just the beginning. Victoria Hartwell is about to discover what it means to pick a fight with someone who owns the battlefield." Outside the aircraft, Victoria was being processed by airport security. Her career in ruins, her future uncertain, and her understanding of power dynamics permanently recalibrated. She'd spent years using her authority to humiliate passengers who didn't meet her arbitrary standards. Now, she was about to learn what humiliation really felt like. The aftermath of Victoria Hartwell's arrest created a strange quiet in the first-class cabin, like the eerie calm that follows a thunderstorm. Passengers who had been eagerly recording what they assumed would be the removal of an inappropriate traveler now found themselves witnesses to something far more significant, a masterclass in how quickly manufactured power could crumble when confronted with legitimate authority. Marcus Blackwell remained standing near his daughter's seat, his presence transforming the entire dynamic of the space. Where Victoria had ruled through intimidation and arbitrary enforcement, Marcus commanded respect through competence and earned authority. The difference was palpable to everyone present. Captain James Mitchell finally appeared from the cockpit, his face pale with the realization that his flight had become ground zero for what would likely become a corporate crisis. As the pilot in command, he bore ultimate responsibility for everything that happened aboard his aircraft, including the criminal behavior of his crew. Mr. Blackwell, Captain Mitchell's voice carried the strained professionalism of someone walking a tightrope. I want to personally apologize for this incident. I was not aware of the situation developing in the cabin until Captain Mitchell Marcus interrupted quietly, "We'll discuss your awareness and response protocols later. Right now, I'm more interested in understanding how Miss Hartwell developed the confidence to behave this way on my aircraft." The question landed like a precision strike. Captain Mitchell felt sweat beading on his forehead as he realized that Marcus was asking about more than just today's incident. He was asking about the culture that had allowed Victoria's behavior to flourish unchecked. Elena Rodriguez, still processing her unexpected promotion, found her voice. "Mr. Blackwell, if I may. Miss Hartwell has been conducting these kinds of passenger challenges for years. This wasn't unusual behavior for her. It was just the first time she picked the wrong target." The implications of Elena's statement rippled through the cabin. Dr. Foster, still recording, recognized the significance immediately. This wasn't an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was evidence of a pattern of discrimination that had been institutionalized within the airline's operations. How many other passengers has she treated this way? Marcus asked, his voice maintaining its calm tone despite the growing storm in his eyes. "I don't have exact numbers," Elena replied carefully, "but I've witnessed multiple instances where passengers were questioned, relocated, or removed based on Miss Hartwell's assessment of whether they belonged in premium cabins. She called it maintaining standards." Diana Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in her seat, remembering her own enthusiastic support for Victoria's actions just minutes earlier. Her social media followers were already responding to her posts about being deceived by a rogue employee, but she knew her initial reactions had been captured on multiple phones. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call that would resonate throughout Meridian Airlines' corporate structure for years to come. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I need you to pull all passenger complaint files involving senior purser Victoria Hartwell for the past 5 years. Cross-reference them with discrimination reports and passenger relocations. Have the legal team review everything for pattern evidence and schedule an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning." He paused, listening to his assistant's response. "No, cancel my meetings for the rest of the week. This takes priority over everything else." And Sarah start drafting a company-wide policy review. "We're going to examine every aspect of our passenger service protocols." As Marcus ended the call, Zara looked up at him with a mixture of pride and concern. She knew her father well enough to recognize when he'd shifted into what she privately called his rebuild the world mode. The methodical, comprehensive approach he used when confronting challenges that threatened his core values. "Dad," she said quietly, "don't burn down the entire airline because of one bad employee." Marcus smiled at his daughter's attempt to moderate his response, but his expression remained serious. Sweetheart Victoria Hartwell didn't operate in a vacuum. She felt confident enough to plant evidence and file false charges against a passenger on a recorded flight. That level of recklessness doesn't develop overnight. Dr. Foster, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, spoke up. "Mr. Blackwell, from a medical perspective, what I witnessed suggests someone who felt completely protected from consequences. In my experience, that kind of behavior indicates structural problems, not just individual bad judgment." Marcus nodded appreciatively. Dr. Foster isn't a trauma surgeon at Emory, yes, sir, and I have to say, your daughter handled this situation with remarkable composure. Most people would have been devastated by false accusations and planted evidence. Zara laughed softly. I learned a long time ago that people's assumptions about me say more about them than they do about me. Plus, I knew my dad was on his way. How did you know to call him Elena? Asked curiosity overcoming her nervousness about speaking directly to the CEO. I didn't call him initially, Zara replied. I texted that I was having an interesting customer service experience on Meridian Flight 447. Dad has alerts set up for any mentions of family members in connection with the airline. Marcus confirmed this with a slight nod. When you own a company that serves millions of passengers annually, you learn that your family's experiences can become public relations crises very quickly. I prefer to address problems before they become scandals. Captain Mitchell, still standing awkwardly near the cockpit door, cleared his throat. Sir, how would you like us to proceed with the flight? We're already significantly delayed. Cancel it, Marcus said without hesitation. I want this aircraft pulled from service for complete documentation and investigation. Transfer all passengers to other flights, full compensation for the inconvenience and upgrades where available. The decision represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue and operational costs, but Marcus made it without consulting accountants or scheduling departments. This was personal now, and financial considerations were secondary to ensuring proper documentation of everything that had occurred. What about Miss Rodriguez? Captain Mitchell asked. Should she remain on duty given her involvement in the incident? Elena stays. Marcus replied firmly. She's the only crew member who demonstrated integrity when it mattered. I want her overseeing the passenger transfer process. As airport ground crew began the complex process of rescheduling passengers and preparing alternative aircraft, word of the incident spread throughout Meridian's corporate structure with viral speed. Executive assistants fielded calls from news organizations who had been alerted by passengers posting videos online. The airline stock price began fluctuating as investors tried to assess the potential impact of the developing scandal. In the corporate communications department, Sarah Williams, no relation to the gate agent, was working with the legal team to craft responses that would minimize damage while acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. They knew they had perhaps hours before the story exploded across social media and traditional news outlets. Diana Pemberton, meanwhile, was discovering that her attempts to distance herself from the incident were being undermined by other passengers who had recorded her enthusiastic support for Victoria's actions. Her hastily crafted social media narrative was falling apart as people began sharing videos that showed her true reactions. Dr. Foster approached Marcus as the cabin began emptying. Mr. Blackwell, I want you to know that I plan to make my video evidence available to investigators, but I won't be sharing it on social media. This situation has enough spectacle without my contribution. I appreciate that, Doctor. Would you be willing to serve as an expert witness if this goes to trial? Absolutely. What I witnessed was a clear abuse of authority, and people need to be held accountable for such behavior. As Zara gathered her belongings, she reflected on how quickly the situation had escalated from routine harassment to criminal charges. She'd experienced discrimination before, but never with such dramatic consequences for the perpetrator. Elena, she called to the newly promoted senior purser, you did the right thing today. That couldn't have been easy. Elena's eyes were still bright with tears of relief and gratitude. Thank you for not letting her get away with it. I've watched her treat people badly for years, always too afraid to speak up because I needed the job. You spoke up when it mattered, Zara replied. That's what counts. As father and daughter prepared to leave the aircraft, Marcus paused to address the few remaining passengers who were waiting for rebooking assistance. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened here today is not representative of Meridian Airlines' values or standards. We will be implementing immediate changes to ensure such incidents never occur again. Your experiences as passengers matter to us, and we will do better. The simple acknowledgement of failure delivered without corporate deflection or legal hedging impressed those who heard it. In an era of manufactured apologies and non-responsibility, Marcus's direct acceptance of accountability stood out. As they walked down the jet bridge, Zara looked at her father with affection and slight concern. "So, what happens to Victoria now?" Marcus's expression was thoughtful, but implacable. "She'll face criminal charges for evidence tampering and filing false reports. Her employment with Meridian is terminated immediately, and she'll be placed on the federal no-fly list. Beyond that, her future is in the hands of the justice system. That seems like enough consequences for one day. For her, perhaps. But Zara, this wasn't just about one bad employee. This was about a system that allowed her to feel safe targeting passengers based on their appearance. That's a bigger problem, and it requires bigger solutions." As they reached the terminal, Marcus was already planning the comprehensive reforms that would reshape Meridian Airlines' passenger service protocols. Victoria Hartwell had intended to humiliate one passenger who didn't meet her arbitrary standards. Instead, she'd triggered a revolution that would change how the entire airline industry thought about discrimination, customer service, and accountability. The Fulton County District Attorney's Office had seen its share of high-profile cases, but the Victoria Hartwell prosecution was generating unusual attention from both media outlets and civil rights organizations. What had started as an airline incident was evolving into a test case for how institutions respond to internal discrimination. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Martinez had been assigned to prosecute the case, and as she reviewed the evidence, she realized she had something rare in criminal law: multiple witnesses, video documentation, and a defendant who had essentially confessed through her actions. Victoria's attempt to manufacture evidence had been so brazen, so thoroughly documented, that building a case was less about proving guilt than about ensuring appropriate consequences. The defendant's behavior demonstrates a pattern of using her position to target passengers based on racial and socioeconomic profiling, Martinez explained to her supervisor. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was calculated criminal behavior designed to support widespread discrimination. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her attorney's office, still struggling to understand how her world had collapsed so completely. David Brennan, a public defender with 20 years of experience, was trying to prepare her for the reality of her situation. "Victoria, you were caught on video planting evidence. You coerced false testimony from another passenger. You filed charges you knew were fabricated. The prosecution has multiple witnesses and documentary evidence. We need to discuss plea options. But I was following procedures Victoria insisted, her voice carrying the desperation of someone whose entire self-image was crumbling. I was protecting the airline standards. Passengers like that don't belong in first class." David felt his own professionalism being tested by his client's continued refusal to accept responsibility. Victoria passengers like that was the CEO's daughter. You framed the owner's family member for theft. Even if your discriminatory motivations were legally defensible, which they aren't, you committed multiple felonies in the process. The attorney's blunt assessment finally penetrated Victoria's denial. She began to understand that her actions hadn't just violated airline policy or social norms, they had crossed the line into criminal behavior that would follow her for the rest of her life. At Meridian Airlines headquarters, Marcus Blackwell was conducting his own investigation with the thoroughness of someone who understood that institutional problems required institutional solutions. The preliminary report from Human Resources painted a disturbing picture of Victoria's 5-year tenure as senior purser. 17 formal complaints involving passenger discrimination, reported HR Director Michael Stevens, reading from a thick file. Multiple reports of passengers being relocated or removed based on subjective assessments of whether they belonged in premium cabins. 8 complaints specifically mentioned racial profiling. Marcus felt a cold anger building as he realized how completely his airline had failed its passengers. How were these complaints handled? Most were classified as passenger service disputes and resolved with standard form apologies and minor compensation. Miss Hartwell's supervisors noted the complaints in her file but described her as maintaining high standards for premium cabin experience. The euphemistic language revealed a deeper problem. Victoria's discriminatory behavior had been reframed as quality control rather than recognized as the civil rights violations they actually represented. Elena Rodriguez, adjusting to her new role as senior purser, was working with the training department to develop protocols that would prevent future incidents. Her first-hand experience with Victoria's methods gave her unique insight into how discrimination could be disguised as customer service. The key Elena explained to the training team is that she never used explicitly racist language. She talked about maintaining standards and appropriate passenger behavior, but everyone understood what she really meant. This coded language had allowed Victoria's superiors to avoid confronting the discriminatory nature of her actions, while still benefiting from her enforcement of unwritten racial hierarchies in premium cabins. Dr. Foster had provided his video evidence to both the criminal prosecution and Meridian's internal investigation. As a trauma surgeon, he was accustomed to documenting events that would later be scrutinized in legal proceedings, and his footage provided a frame-by-frame account of Victoria's evidence tampering. What struck me most, Dr. Foster told investigators, was how practiced she seemed. The way she maneuvered the bracelet, the confident tone when she discovered it. This felt rehearsed, like she'd done something similar before. His medical training had taught him to recognize patterns, and Victoria's behavior suggested someone who had refined her techniques through repetition. 3 weeks after the incident, Victoria's preliminary hearing attracted significant media attention. Civil rights organizations sent observers, airline industry publications covered the proceedings, and social media buzzed with commentary about discrimination in commercial aviation. Zara attended the hearing not out of vindictiveness, but from a sense that her presence was important for other passengers who had been targeted, but lacked the resources to fight back. "I want people to see that there are consequences for this behavior," she told the reporter who asked why she was attending. "For too long, passengers have been told to accept mistreatment as part of air travel. That needs to change." Victoria's appearance shocked those who had known her during her years with Meridian. The confident, controlling woman who had ruled first-class cabins with iron authority had been replaced by someone who looked diminished, uncertain, and profoundly lost. When called to enter her plea, Victoria stood on trembling legs and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, "Guilty, Your Honor." The guilty plea triggered a wave of relief among Meridian's legal team, who had feared a prolonged trial that would keep the airline's discrimination problems in the headlines for months. But Marcus had already committed to comprehensive reforms, regardless of the legal proceedings. "This case exposed failures in our training, supervision, and complaint resolution processes," Marcus announced at a press conference following Victoria's plea. "We're implementing changes that will ensure no passenger ever experiences what my daughter endured." The reforms Marcus announced were sweeping and industry-leading. Mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, real-time reporting structures for discrimination complaints, independent oversight of passenger service disputes, and most significantly, personal liability for employees who engaged in discriminatory behavior. "We're making it clear that Meridian Airlines employees who violate passengers' civil rights will face immediate termination and potential criminal prosecution," Marcus stated. "This isn't just about policy, it's about accountability." Victoria's sentencing hearing held 6 weeks after her plea became a forum for her victims to finally have their voices heard. Maria Santos, the mother who had been forced off a flight for breastfeeding her infant, testified about the trauma of being stranded in an airport with a hungry baby. "She made me feel like I was doing something wrong by feeding my child," Maria told the court through tears. "She made me feel like I didn't deserve to be treated with basic human dignity." Other passengers came forward with similar stories. Elderly Hispanic passengers questioned about their ticket legitimacy. Black business travelers subjected to additional security checks young people of color assumed to be using fraudulent boarding passes. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of someone who had weaponized her authority to enforce racial hierarchies in commercial aviation. Victoria's standards had consistently required certain passengers to prove their worthiness for services they had legitimately purchased. Judge Sarah Morrison listened to victim testimony for 3 hours before addressing Victoria directly. Miss Hartwell, you abused a position of trust to target vulnerable passengers based on their race and appearance. You used your authority not to serve customers but to humiliate them. When challenged, you committed serious crimes to avoid accountability for your discriminatory behavior. The judge paused, studying Victoria's tear-streaked face. This court sentences you to 4 years in state prison followed by 3 years of probation. You will pay full restitution to all identified victims, and you are permanently banned from employment in commercial aviation. Furthermore, you are placed on the federal no-fly list for life. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs for the second and final time, she looked back toward the gallery, where Zara sat with quiet dignity. There was no triumph in Zara's expression, no satisfaction at watching her tormentor receive consequences. Instead, there was something that looked almost like pity. Victoria had destroyed her own life in pursuit of power over people she considered beneath her. The irony was complete. In trying to put Zara in her place, she had lost her own place in the world entirely. Justice had been served, but as Zara would later reflect, the most important victory wasn't Victoria's punishment. It was the changes that would protect future passengers from experiencing the same discrimination. 6 months after Victoria Hartwell's conviction, Meridian Airlines unveiled the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in commercial aviation history. Marcus Blackwell had invested over $50 million in reforms that touched every aspect of passenger service from initial training through ongoing oversight and accountability measures. The centerpiece of the transformation was the Zara Protocol, named not for his daughter specifically, but for the principle that every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their appearance, age, race, or perceived socioeconomic status. The protocol established clear guidelines for passenger interaction that eliminated the subjective judgments that had allowed discrimination to flourish. The old system relied on individual crew members' interpretations of appropriate passenger behavior, explained Dr. Amelia Washington, who had been retained as Meridian's Director of Equity and Inclusion. The Zara Protocol removes subjectivity by creating specific measurable standards for passenger service that focus on behavior rather than appearance. Elena Rodriguez, now serving as Senior Manager of Passenger Experience, worked directly with Dr. Washington to develop training programs that addressed both conscious and unconscious bias in passenger interactions. Her unique perspective as both a victim of workplace discrimination and a witness to institutional failure made her an invaluable advocate for meaningful reform. "We're not just telling employees not to discriminate," Elena explained to a group of airline industry executives who had come to study Meridian's reforms. "We're giving them tools to recognize their own biases protocols for handling challenging situations fairly and support structures that reward inclusive behavior rather than punishing it." The training program Elena and Dr. Washington developed was unlike anything previously implemented in commercial aviation. Rather than brief workshops or online modules, Meridian employees underwent intensive, ongoing education that included role-playing exercises, bias recognition, training conflict de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency development. More importantly, the training was backed by accountability measures that made discrimination professionally and financially costly for employees. Any crew member found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior faced immediate termination, personal liability for damages, and permanent employment bans throughout the industry. "We're making it clear that discrimination isn't just morally wrong. It's economically stupid," Marcus explained to the Wall Street Journal in an interview about Meridian's reforms. Passengers of color represent billions of dollars in annual travel spending. Any airline that alienates those customers through discriminatory treatment is essentially giving away market share to competitors. The financial argument for inclusion resonated throughout the industry. Other airlines began quietly implementing their own anti-discrimination measures, recognizing that passenger loyalty increasingly depended on respectful treatment, regardless of demographic characteristics. Meridian's passenger reporting apparatus represented another innovation that other carriers studied and eventually adopted. Rather than forcing customers to navigate complex complaint procedures, The airline created multiple channels for real-time discrimination reporting, including anonymous text messaging online forms and direct communication with specially trained customer service representatives. The key insight Dr. Washington explained to a congressional subcommittee studying discrimination in transportation was that most passengers don't report discrimination because the complaint process is more burdensome than the original mistreatment. By making reporting simple and ensuring rapid response, we've created accountability mechanisms that actually function. The results were measurable and impressive. Within 6 months of implementing the new protocols, Meridian's customer satisfaction scores among passengers of color increased by 40%. Discrimination complaints dropped by 80%, not because discrimination was being hidden more effectively, but because it was being prevented more successfully. Perhaps most significantly, Meridian began attracting passengers and employees who had previously chosen other airlines specifically to avoid discriminatory treatment. The company's reputation for inclusive customer service became a competitive advantage that translated directly into market share and profitability. Marcus spoke about these changes at the annual Airlines for America conference, addressing an audience that included CEOs from every major carrier in the country. Some of you are wondering whether comprehensive anti-discrimination measures are worth the investment, he said, standing before the industry leaders who had initially been skeptical of his reforms. Let me share some numbers that might change your perspective. He clicked to a slide showing Meridian's financial performance since implementing the Zara protocol. Customer retention among diverse passengers up 35%. Employee satisfaction in customer-facing roles up 42%. Positive social media mentions up 60%. Legal expenses related to discrimination complaints down 90%. And most importantly for this audience, stock price performance since the reforms were announced up 28%. The numbers spoke louder than any moral argument could have. Treating passengers with dignity wasn't just ethically correct, it was profitable in ways that discriminatory practices never could be. Other airlines began implementing versions of Meridian's protocols, though none matched the comprehensiveness of the original program. Industry publications started featuring articles about dignity-based customer service and inclusive aviation policies. Flight attendant training programs began emphasizing bias recognition and cultural competency alongside traditional safety procedures. The transformation wasn't limited to Meridian's internal policies. Marcus used his position as a prominent airline CEO to advocate for industry-wide changes in passenger rights protections, federal oversight of discrimination complaints, and regulatory requirements for bias training in commercial aviation. Individual airlines can implement excellent policies, he testified before a Senate subcommittee on transportation, but true change requires industry-wide standards that make discrimination uneconomical and legally risky for any carrier. His advocacy helped prompt Department of Transportation investigations into discriminatory practices across the industry, leading to new federal guidelines that essentially required all airlines to adopt measures similar to Meridian's Zara protocol. Zara herself became an unexpected advocate for passenger rights reform, speaking at conferences and contributing to policy discussions about discrimination in service industries. Her experience on Flight 447 had given her unique insight into how institutional bias affected individual passengers, and her platform as the CEO's daughter amplified her message in ways that might not have been possible otherwise. What happened to me was terrible, she told an audience at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual conference, but I had resources and connections that most passengers don't have. The real test of these reforms is whether they protect vulnerable travelers who can't call the CEO when they're mistreated. Early indicators suggested that the reforms were indeed protecting passengers who lacked Zara's advantages. Discrimination complaints were being resolved more quickly, and fairly crew members were receiving better training on respectful passenger interaction, and most importantly, passengers from diverse backgrounds were reporting more positive travel experiences. The transformation of Meridian Airlines demonstrated that comprehensive institutional change was possible when leadership committed resources and attention to addressing discrimination as a business problem rather than just a public relations challenge. Victoria Hartwell's attempt to humiliate one passenger had inadvertently triggered reforms that would protect millions of travelers for years to come. Her abuse of authority had been thoroughly documented, prosecuted, and punished, but more importantly, it had been prevented from recurring through changes that addressed the root causes, rather than just the consequences of institutional discrimination. 3 years into her 4-year sentence, Victoria Hartwell sat in the common area of Georgia Women's Correctional Institution, struggling to understand how the woman she had been could have believed the things she'd once held as unquestionable truths. Prison had a way of stripping away the artificial constructs that allowed people to maintain comfortable delusions about themselves and their place in the world. Her cellmate, Maria Santos, the same woman she had forced off a flight for breastfeeding 3 years earlier, had been serving time for a drug possession charge that reflected the kind of targeting by law enforcement that Victoria was only now beginning to understand. The irony of their shared living situation had not been lost on either woman. "You really didn't think you were doing anything wrong, did you?" Maria asked one evening as they sat reading in their small shared space. The question wasn't accusatory. 3 years of shared meals, shared fears, and shared struggles had created an unlikely foundation for honest conversation. Victoria looked up from the sociology textbook she'd been studying as part of a prison education program. Reading about institutional racism, unconscious bias, and power dynamics through the lens of her own experiences had been a profoundly unsettling education. "I thought I was maintaining standards." Victoria admitted, her voice carrying the shame of someone who had been forced to confront the ugly truth about her own motivations. "I convinced myself that questioning certain passengers was about security, about protecting the airline's reputation. I never admitted to myself that it was really about protecting my own sense of superiority." Maria nodded thoughtfully. "My son is 8 now. When I get out next month, I'm going to have to explain to him why his mother was in prison. I've been thinking about how to help him understand that good people can do terrible things when they let fear and prejudice guide their decisions." The comment stung because Victoria recognized herself in it. She had never thought of herself as a bad person, even as she routinely humiliated passengers based on their race and appearance. She had constructed elaborate justifications that allowed her to maintain her self-image as a professional, simply doing her job well. Dr. Patricia Monroe, the prison psychologist who ran therapy groups for inmates dealing with issues of prejudice and institutional bias, had helped Victoria begin the difficult process of understanding how her own trauma had been weaponized against others. Growing up poor and being looked down upon doesn't excuse discriminating against others, Dr. Monroe had explained during one of their sessions. But understanding how your own experiences with classism and social rejection shaped your worldview can help you recognize why you felt the need to exclude others once you gained power. Victoria had resisted this analysis, initially clinging to the belief that her actions had been motivated by professional responsibility rather than personal psychology. But 3 years of intensive therapy, combined with the daily reality of being the powerless one in an institutional hierarchy, had gradually broken down her defensive narrative. She began to understand that her obsession with maintaining standards had been a way of ensuring that she would never again be the person being excluded, the person being looked down upon, the person being told she didn't belong. By becoming the gatekeeper, she had tried to guarantee her own permanent inclusion in spaces that had once rejected her. But the cost of that psychological safety had been the dignity and humanity of passengers who deserved better treatment than she had received as a child. Her attempt to escape her own experiences of discrimination had led her to perpetuate even worse discrimination against others. The education program Victoria participated in included courses on civil rights history, conflict resolution, and what prison administrators called community reintegration planning. The latter was designed to help inmates develop skills and perspectives that would reduce recidivism and help them contribute positively to society after release. Victoria found herself drawn particularly to courses on restorative justice approaches to addressing harm that focused on healing for victims and accountability for offenders rather than simple punishment. The concepts challenged everything she had believed about justice, responsibility, and redemption. Traditional punishment assumes that making someone suffer will prevent future wrongdoing, explained Professor James Liu, who taught the restorative justice course. But research shows that people change their behavior when they understand the real impact of their actions and develop empathy for those they've harmed. For Victoria, this meant confronting not just the legal consequences of her actions, but the human cost of her discrimination. She began writing letters to her victims, not seeking forgiveness, but acknowledging the pain she had caused and taking full responsibility for her choices. Most of the letters went unanswered, which Victoria understood and accepted. Some victims responded with anger, which she also accepted as appropriate and deserved. But a few, like Maria, engaged in correspondence that helped both women process their experiences and find paths toward healing. "I don't forgive you for what you did to me," Maria wrote in one of her letters, "but I appreciate that you're finally taking responsibility for it. Maybe that's enough for now." Victoria's release date approached with a mixture of anticipation and terror. She had no job prospects. Her conviction and placement on the no-fly list had effectively banned her from the airline industry, and few employers were willing to hire someone with her criminal history. She had lost her home, her savings, and most of her relationships. But she had gained something she hadn't possessed when she'd entered prison: a clear understanding of how her own pain had been transformed into a weapon against others, and a commitment to ensuring that such transformation never happened again. Dr. Monroe had helped Victoria develop a reintegration plan that included community service work with civil rights organizations, continued therapy to address the underlying issues that had driven her discriminatory behavior, and advocacy work with other service industry employees to prevent the kind of institutional bias that had flourished under her authority. Redemption, Dr. Monroe explained during their final session before Victoria's release, isn't about erasing the harm you've caused. It's about dedicating your life to ensuring that such harm doesn't happen again. Victoria left prison with that understanding, carrying both the weight of her victim's pain and the possibility of using her experience to prevent future discrimination. Her story was no longer about the abuse of power, but about the long, difficult work of accountability and change. The Meridian Contemporary Art Gallery in downtown Atlanta had become one of the South's most prestigious venues for emerging artists, and tonight it was hosting Zara Blackwell's first major solo exhibition. Turbulence, power, dignity, and transformation filled 3 floors of the converted warehouse space with mixed media installations that explored themes of institutional bias, personal resilience, and social justice. At 27, Zara had evolved from an art student facing discrimination on an airplane into one of the most compelling voices in contemporary social justice art. Her work had been featured in museums across the country, but tonight's exhibition held special significance. It was being hosted by the gallery her father had founded as part of Meridian Airlines' Community Investment Initiative. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a massive installation titled Seat 2A, a recreation of an airplane cabin interior where visitors could experience interactive audio stories from passengers who had faced discrimination during air travel. The seat assignments corresponded to different demographic experiences, allowing visitors to literally sit where others had sat and hear their stories through high-quality headphones. Marcus Blackwell moved through the gallery with quiet pride, watching art collectors, critics, and community members engage with his daughter's work. The transformation of both Zara and the airline industry over the past 5 years had been remarkable, but tonight felt like a culmination of lessons learned and progress achieved. Meister, Blackwell approached a young journalist from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. "Can you talk about how your daughter's experience 5 years ago influenced both her art and your airline's policies?" Marcus smiled, watching Zara explain one of her pieces to a group of collectors. "What happened on Flight 447 was traumatic for my family, but it also revealed problems that had been hidden for too long. Zara's art and Meridian's policy changes both represent responses to institutional failure attempts to ensure that dignity and respect aren't privileges for the few, but rights for everyone. The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. In the gallery itself, this is part of Meridian's community investment program. Art has the power to change how people think about social issues, Marcus replied. By supporting artists who address justice and equality, we're investing in cultural change that extends far beyond our own industry. Near the gallery's entrance, Elena Rodriguez admired a piece called Voices in the Galley, a sound installation that featured recorded conversations between flight attendants discussing passenger interactions. Elena's own voice was part of the piece, sharing her experience of choosing truth over job security during the Flight 447 incident. It's strange hearing my own words in an art gallery, Elena told Dr. Foster, who had come to the opening to support Zara's work. But important too, people need to understand that discrimination requires bystanders to stay silent. Dr. Foster nodded, studying the installation with his characteristic attention to detail. Your decision to speak up changed everything. Medical research shows that institutional change almost always requires someone inside the structure to break ranks and tell the truth. As a medical professional doctor, Foster had become interested in the parallels between institutional bias in healthcare and other service industries. He'd written several papers about discrimination in patient care using the Flight 447 case as an example of how comprehensive reform could address deep-rooted problems. The gallery's catering staff moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, offering champagne and hors d'oeuvres to the well-dressed guests. Among them, almost invisible in her black uniform and subdued demeanor, Victoria Hartwell carefully balanced a silver tray while navigating between clusters of art patrons. At 42, Victoria looked older than her years. Prison and its aftermath had taken a physical toll, but more significantly, the psychological weight of confronting her own capacity for cruelty had fundamentally changed how she moved through the world. Where she had once carried herself with aggressive confidence, she now exhibited the careful humility of someone who understood how quickly authority could become abuse. Working for the catering company was honest employment, but it was also a daily reminder of how completely her life had been transformed by her own choices. The woman who had once ruled airplane cabins with iron authority now served drinks to people who barely noticed her existence. Zara was discussing her installation Mirror Mirror with a group of gallery patrons when she noticed the familiar face among the catering staff. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded space and something passed between them. Recognition, acknowledgement, and perhaps a form of closure that neither had expected to find. Victoria approached slowly, holding her tray with hands that trembled slightly. "Miss Blackwell," she said quietly, "I wanted to say, the exhibition is beautiful, your work is very powerful." Zara studied Victoria's face, seeing genuine appreciation rather than the calculating assessment she remembered from Flight 447. "Thank you. That means something coming from you. I know I don't have the right to ask." Victoria continued, her voice barely audible above the gallery's ambient noise. "But I wanted you to know that I've spent the last 5 years trying to understand and make amends for what I did. Not to you specifically. I know that's not my place, but to try to ensure it never happens again." Zara reached for a glass of champagne from Victoria's tray, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. "I hope that's true. What you did was wrong, but what matters now is what you do with the rest of your life." "The service here is excellent tonight," Zara added, placing a $20 bill on Victoria's tray. "Thank you for your professionalism." The words echoed what Zara had said at another gallery 5 years earlier, but with a different context and meaning. This wasn't charity or condescension, it was recognition of Victoria's humanity and an acknowledgement that redemption, however difficult and incomplete, was possible for those willing to do the work. Victoria nodded, once her eyes bright with unshed tears, and continued through the gallery crowd. She had lost everything she'd once thought important: authority, status, respect based on fear rather than merit. But she had gained something more valuable, an understanding of her own capacity for both harm and healing, and a commitment to ensuring that her story served as a warning rather than a model. As the evening continued, art lovers, critics, and community members engaged with Zara's work, discussing themes of power, prejudice, and transformation. But perhaps the most meaningful moment had been the brief exchange between victim and perpetrator, two women whose lives had been forever changed by events in Seat 2. A now finding a form of peace in the shared understanding that growth, however painful, remained possible. The exhibition would run for 3 months, sparking conversations about discrimination justice and the ongoing work of creating a more equitable society. But the real transformation in hearts' minds and institutional practices would continue long after the artworks were taken down, a living testament to the power of truth, accountability, and the possibility of redemption through dedicated effort to make amends. This story serves as a reminder that character isn't defined by the price of your ticket or the color of your skin. It's revealed by how you treat others when you think no one is watching. Victoria Hartwell discovered that manufactured power crumbles quickly when confronted with authentic authority, and that the consequences of discrimination extend far beyond individual discomfort to institutional transformation. The changes at Meridian Airlines became an industry standard, protecting millions of passengers from the kind of humiliation Victoria had routinely inflicted. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. It's about creating a world where such punishment becomes unnecessary because the underlying problems have been solved. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to remember that respect costs nothing but means everything. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. Subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of justice and transformation that prove change is possible when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss these powerful stories that remind us all that true leadership isn't about having power over others, but about using whatever power you have to lift others up, especially when they least expect it and most deserve it. Share this video with your friends and family because sometimes the most important conversations start with the stories that make us think differently about the world around us. Your comments and engagement help these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Together, we can create a world where dignity, respect, and justice aren't the exception, they're the rule.